Christ. The year was 1967. My dad was a freshman at the University of Minnesota. He played in the marching band during Golden Gopher football games. The Gophers were good in 1967. The Gophers were so good, in fact, that after beating Wisconsin in the last game of the season, they were set up to play in college football's grand showcase, the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California, on New Year's Day. All that had to happen is heavily favored Purdue needed to beat Indiana. Rose Bowl plans seemed so inevitable that my dad was given an itinerary for the upcoming trip to California. Well, Dad has never seen the Rose Bowl in person. Indiana upset Purdue to go to the Rose Bowl instead, and the Gophers want to get close to going to the Rose Bowl again during Dad's 4 years of college or ever since. Now, Dad has always talked about going to the Rose Bowl when the Gophers perhaps eventually play in it. In the year 2000, the Gophers upset perennial powerhouse Ohio State. My dad started looking into plane tickets for January travel to California, only to see the Gophers lose the next week to lowly Indiana. So the dream died once again. So the wait to go to the Rose Bowl has been 52 years for Gopher fans like my dad, who have longed to spend New Year's Day in sunny California. For my dad is a realist about the Gopher football team. He knows the Gophers have numerous disadvantages, both in terms of local talent, but also financial resources to compete with Big Ten powers such as Michigan, Ohio State, or even more recently Wisconsin, that always seemed to play in the Rose Bowl. Sid Hartman is the most famous sports writer in all of Minnesota. Sid began his career writing about the Gophers and other teams in 1945. Sid is still writing and will turn 100 years old next spring. And here's the thing that I love about Sid. Every spring or early fall is going to be the year that the Gopher football team is going to finally break through. It doesn't matter to Sid if the Gophers were 1-11 the previous campaign. For the Gophers' small but dedicated fan base is about to travel to Pasadena, California to see the Rose Bowl in droves. For Sid, when it comes to the Gophers, is the eternal optimist. When Sid was growing up in Minneapolis, the Gopher football team was winning national championships. Sid remembers the Gophers' trips to Pasadena in 1961 and 1962 fondly. And Sid always believes that somehow, some way, the Minnesota farm kids will triumph against the bigger, faster, and stronger kids from Ohio. For my dad, Sid and the Gophers lead us into our New Testament lesson for today from the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. Now, before we begin, let me ask the following question. What is the difference between Sid Hartman-like optimism and hope? Now, optimism and hope might seem to be the exact same thing until you come to our lesson. Our lesson begins with the following verse. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Hebrews 11 then proceeds to give a history of those who in the earliest days of the Old Testament clung to both faith and hope, regardless of their present circumstances. Abel, Enoch, Noah, and finally Abraham. Abraham's life begins in the land of Ur, which lies in modern-day Iraq. And Abraham had been doing quite well in Ur, living a comfortable day-to-day existence, having accumulated all sorts of land and possessions. One day, God proceeds to interrupt Abraham's life by declaring, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation." Here's the problem. Abraham is already 75 at this point. His wife Sarah is long considered to be barren. No ordinary thinking person would have thought Abraham's move in the midst of both wealth and comfort to be a good idea. So what did the years ahead from this point bring Abraham? Abraham, as soon as he left the land of Ur, experiences a great famine in the land of Canaan. So he is forced to journey to Egypt. While in Egypt, the Pharaoh tries to steal his wife, putting Abraham's own life at risk. Abraham then separates from his closest family member, Lot. His wife Sarah remained continually barren, so she gave Abraham permission to conceive a child with her handmaiden, Hagar, instead. Hagar and Abraham's son would be called Ishmael. And when Abraham is 99 years old, God declares that Abraham, through Sarah, will still be a father of many nations. At this point, Sarah finally gets pregnant with her son named Isaac. Only for Abraham, Hagar, Ishmael, Isaac, and Sarah to have so much conflict upon living together that they're forced to separate. Then at the end of all this, Abraham is asked to sacrifice his beloved Isaac upon the mount of the Lord, only for the Lord to finally intervene as Abraham held a knife to his boy's throat. For Abraham becomes a widow then, after his beloved Sarah dies. Abraham eventually dies 100 years after being asked to leave behind his life of comfort in Ur. So Abraham's story nearly has it all: uncertain living arrangement, famine, infertility, family separation, and grief. For God might have chosen Abraham with the most unique of callings, but this didn't mean that Abraham didn't have many dark days where he longed to see a clear sign of God's promises someday coming true. But in the midst of all these circumstances, Abraham never abandoned either faith or hope. For it was nearly 2,000 years later that the fulfillment of Abraham leaving behind Ur for a better place was made known. As our Hebrews lesson concludes, they, Abraham's descendants, were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. For Abraham left Ur amidst the greatest of uncertainties, so that he and his descendants may ultimately inherit heaven upon the cross of Christ. For what is the difference between optimism and hope as displayed within the life of Abraham? For optimists, like Sid Hartman, tend to see the best in situations and the best in people. Optimism is, in many cases, a good thing. Optimism, though, has its limits. It's not enough to be optimistic when, like Abraham, you long for one child or many children, only for it to seem medically impossible. It's not enough to be optimistic with the faith of your long-awaited child hanging in the balance. It's not enough to be optimistic as we buried our own loved ones and seem soon to follow them. For Abraham had numerous events in his life take place that should have crushed his optimistic spirit. Abraham instead clung to hope. For what is the difference between optimism and hope? Optimism is based on human potential, whereas hope is based on God's eternal promises. For optimism can only take you as far as the grave, whereas hope can take you beyond the grave. Hope is found in the moments when mere optimism fails. Lutheran preacher Michael Voss tells the following tale. Harold Russell was born in 1914. Russell was struggling in life at the age of 27, thinking himself a failure because he was working in a supermarket. The Japanese then attacked Pearl Harbor. Russell enlisted in the U.S. Army in response, hoping to turn the direction of his life around. In 1944, while teaching demolition work to his fellow soldiers, a defective fuse went off, costing Harold Russell both his hands. So Harold Russell, as he woke up in a hospital bed, seeing nubs where his hands used to be, thought his life was now over. And as he lied in his hospital bed, day after day, Harold Russell kept entering into a deeper and deeper despair, until one day he receives a visit from a fellow soldier who had also lost both his hands. And Russell couldn't quite make sense of why his fellow soldier was so joyful after his own accident. The soldier then turned to Russell before declaring, "There's one thing that you ought to keep in mind. You are not crippled. You are merely handicapped." For the great Christian hope is this: life, such as in the story of Harold Russell, can hurt and handicap us in many ways, even defeating our optimism. But life, it cannot cripple us. For hope has a way of turning what appear to be crucifixions into eventual resurrections. For Harold Russell will go on to live a remarkable life without any hands. He would marry his childhood sweetheart, act in motion pictures, even winning an Academy Award, and he would become a best-selling author. For reality is the following: we will, like Harold Russell or Abraham, have our circumstances from which we wonder, where in our life can hope possibly come from? And with this in mind, let me close with one final story from the Lutheran Hour. Over a century ago, when steamships full of passengers would frequently venture onto Lake Superior, a great fog broke out. The passengers grew quickly concerned as the ship didn't even slow down. The passengers go track down the captain's first mate to complain about the ship's speed. The first mate then gave the passengers some wise advice as he declared, "Do not be afraid. The fog lies low, and the captain is high above it, for he can see where we are going." For we, like these passengers, Abraham or Harold Russell, will all have our moments when we can't quite make sense of the waters behind us or the waters ahead of us. And the following is okay, because our Savior has gone and seen the darkest of places before us, only to walk out again 3 days later. So we are not merely optimistic about any potential rose bowls that lie ahead. Instead, we cling to the great